It usually begins as a kind of soul tiredness you can't quite name, not the tired that sleep alone can fix, a slower, quieter fatigue that lives under your ribs, the kind you carry through your day while you keep moving, keep replying, keep doing what needs to be done. Maybe you felt it when you opened your eyes this morning. Maybe it showed up halfway through the afternoon, a small weight behind your thoughts, a sense that even the simplest things felt heavier than they should. You did your best anyway. You always do, and now somehow this hour has found you here, in the dimness, phone in your hand or screen glowing in the dark, looking for something you might not be able to explain out loud. Not advice exactly, not solutions, just a voice that doesn't demand anything from you. If that's you, you're not mistaken for being here. There is a reason you press play, even if you can't put it into words. Some part of you has been carrying a question, or a sadness, or a quiet confusion about the path you're on. You've held it all day without dropping it, without letting it show too much. And now, in this softer hour, it has permission to rise closer to the surface. Before we go anywhere together, just notice where you already are. Notice the room around you, even if you can't see it clearly. The way the walls feel closer at night. The way everyday objects become silhouettes. The glow of a single light or the blue of your screen reflecting faintly on the ceiling. Notice the darkness itself, not as an enemy, just as a presence. The particular texture of this hour, the way noises outside have quieted or shifted into something slower, a car far away, a radiator, a faint hum you only really hear when everything else has stopped. Feel the weight of the hour on your shoulders, not as pressure, just as proof that you have made it this far. This day has happened to you. You have moved through it, thought by thought, moment by moment. You reached the end of it, even if it didn't feel like an achievement. If you'd like, you can gently share where you're listening from, the city or country, and what time it is for you right now. You can leave it in the comments, not to perform, not to impress, but to quietly say, I'm here too, because there are others lying in their own rooms, in their own darkness, listening with you in the same stretched out hour. Different places, different clocks, the same human heaviness. Tonight, we are not here to fix you. You are not a problem to be solved before you sleep. We are here to sit beside something older than your current situation. Older than this week, this year, this season of your life. Something Jung spent a lifetime circling with careful words. The truth that there is a kind of darkness the soul does not just endure, but somehow needs. You may be in such a darkness now, or you may only be standing at its edge, sensing it nearby. Either way, nothing in you is wrong for being here. Your questions are not a glitch. Your sadness is not a failure. This strange deep tiredness that doesn't go away with a good night's sleep is trying to speak in a language that doesn't use sentences. Tonight, we will move slowly with it. We will let Jung's way of seeing give shape to what you've been feeling, not to make it smaller, but to make it less lonely. For now, it is enough to know this. You are here in this room at this hour. The darkness around you is not empty, and you do not have to walk through it alone. Carl Jung is often remembered as a great thinker, a doctor of the mind, a man with theories and terms and diagrams that try to explain why we are the way we are. But before he was any of that, he was a human being who lost his way. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, in a quiet, private way, a way that looked, from the outside, like a successful life carrying on as normal, and yet inside the lights went out. He did not come to darkness as a teacher. He came to it as a wanderer, as someone who woke up one day and realized that the story he had been living no longer fit. The beliefs, the roles, the identity that once felt solid began to loosen. His work, his reputation, the ways people saw him, all of it stayed, but the sense of inner rightness slipped away. That is the strange cruelty of these inner nights. Life on the surface keeps moving. Inside, something is breaking open. When Jung spoke of darkness, he did not mean simple sadness. He did not mean a mood you could fix with better habits or more effort. He was touching something deeper, something older. A kind of night that arrives when the soul quietly decides it cannot keep pretending. He sometimes called it a descent, a going down. Not a fall from grace, but a fall from certainty. The dark night is often mistaken for depression. Sometimes it can look like it. The heaviness, the loss of interest, the feeling that the colours have drained out of the world. But what he pointed to is not just a collapse. It is a threshold, a doorway that appears when the old image of who you thought you were begins to dissolve. You are not only sad, you are becoming unfamiliar to yourself. There is a moment, often, when the mind tries to fight this. It says, this is wrong, this is illness, this is failure. If I were stronger, this would not be happening. But from Jung's view, this darkness is not a punishment. It is not life taking something away because you are unworthy. It is the psyche, the deeper organising intelligence within you, making room, clearing space for something you did not know you were carrying. During the years that later became his Red Book, Jung entered his own long night. Outwardly, he was still a respected psychiatrist, still a figure in the world of psychology. Inwardly, it felt as if the ground beneath his feet gave way. The ideas he had built his career on no longer felt alive. The path he thought he was walking faded from view. There was no replacement waiting, only a strange, vast emptiness. He began to dream more vividly, to see images, figures, scenes that rose up from somewhere he could not map. They were confusing, sometimes frightening, sometimes tender. He wrote them, drew them, argued with them, listened to them, not because he wanted to be mystical, but because he realized that ignoring them hurt more than facing them. The night was not going away. It wanted to be entered. That was his darkness, not glamorous, not romantic, long stretches of uncertainty, ordinary days coloured by an invisible weight, moments of feeling foolish, lost, even unstable. The mind prefers straight lines and clear labels. The soul travels differently. It circles, it waits, it whispers in symbols before it ever speaks in clear language. In this kind of night, the person you used to be feels like a costume that no longer fits. You can still put it on. You can still perform it, but you feel the seams pulling. You feel how much effort it takes to keep it from ripping. Darkness for Jung was the period when you stop being able to hold it all together in the old way. Not because you're weak, because something truer inside you refuses to be hidden any longer. He understood that the soul sometimes leads us into places the mind would never choose. The mind wants progress, clarity, proof. It wants to move upward and forward in straight, measurable steps. The soul is less interested in those directions. It moves toward wholeness. And wholeness often lies in the places we have avoided, denied, or quietly feared. So the psyche does something that, from the outside, looks unkind. It withdraws energy from what no longer serves. Work that once felt charged becomes flat. Relationships that once defined you start to feel distant. Even if nothing obvious has changed, success tastes strangely hollow. You find yourself staring at your own life as if it belongs to someone else. This is not proof that you've ruined everything. It is often the first sign that something deep within you is asking to be known. For Jung, darkness was that in-between territory. No longer who you were, not yet who you are becoming. The ego, the conscious sense of me, feels like it is dying. In a way it is. The version of you built on borrowed timelines, unexamined beliefs, survival strategies, and other people's expectations begins to lose its grip. This can feel like losing your mind. Inwardly, though, something is quietly reordering itself. When he wrote and painted in the Red Book, he was not creating a grand theory for others. He was trying to stay in relationship with himself while everything familiar fell apart. He was learning to sit with images and feelings that had no obvious meaning, to trust that the night had its own intelligence. He once suggested that the soul is not in us, we are in the soul. That is how big he felt this inner life to be. Larger than our plans, larger than our labels. In this view, your own darkness is not a verdict. It is not life telling you that you have failed. It is an invitation that does not feel like one. A summons into a room with no furniture, no instructions, no clear way back. The mind protests. It wants answers. It wants to know how long this will last, what it will cost, whether it will be worth it. The soul rarely responds in that language. It responds by staying, by not letting you return to the old story, no matter how desperately you reach for it. Jung walked through years of that kind of night. Not all at once, not in a straight line. There were days of clarity and days of fog, times when he trusted the process, and times when he was sure he had lost everything that mattered. If your life feels dimmed, if your identity feels blurred, if you cannot recognize the person you're becoming, you are not alone in that landscape. Someone before you has wandered there. Many have. For him, darkness was not the end of the road. It was the part of the road no one tells you about. The unlit stretch where your eyes adjust slowly, where your old ways of navigating no longer work, and yet, step by gentle step, something unseen begins to guide you. Not from above, from within. For a long time you have been building yourself. Not on purpose, not as a grand project, just slowly, quietly, year after year. You learned how to speak in ways that keep the peace. You learned which parts of you get praised and which parts make the room go silent. You learned how to look capable, how to sound fine, how to move through the world without drawing the wrong kind of attention. You became someone, a self that knows what to say in an interview, a self that knows which stories to tell on a first date, a self that knows when to laugh, when to nod, when to hide what's really happening inside. This is not fake. It is not a lie. It is the version of you that helped you survive your life so far. The self that learned the rules, carried the expectations, kept the chaos away, or at least tried to. Psychology sometimes calls this the ego. Not ego as arrogance, but ego as structure. The organizing story of who you are and how you belong. Most of the time, this structure works well enough. It gets you through school. It gets you through work. It lets you send emails and pay bills and hold conversations without falling apart. But there comes a time for many people when the self they have carefully built begins to feel too tight, like clothes that once fit perfectly, but now pinch at the seams. Nothing dramatic happens on the outside. Inside, though, something is straining, pressing, asking for more room. You might notice it as a strange fatigue around being yourself, a subtle resistance to the roles you've always played. the reliable one, the achiever, the caretaker, the funny one, the strong one. You can still do it. You can still show up as that person, but it costs more than it used to. You finish the day and feel oddly depleted, not from what you did, but from who you had to be while doing it. Jung spoke about a moment in life when the ego, this constructed self, can no longer be the unquestioned centre of the story. He called it the relativization of the ego, a quiet, unsettling shift when I is no longer the sun, everything else must orbit. At first, this can feel like something is going wrong. You may feel less certain, less special, less in control. You may find yourself doubting what once felt obvious. Do I really want this career? Do I actually believe what I've been saying I believe? Am I living my life, or just rehearsing a script I never wrote? To the ego, this questioning feels dangerous. It hears the whisper. Maybe you're not the centre, and interprets it as maybe you're nothing. So it tightens, defends, works harder to keep the old identity intact. You might notice yourself doubling down on busyness, taking on more, proving more, posting more, polishing the story of your life until it shines again. You might cling to the familiar labels, the job title, the relationship role, the future plan that makes everything make sense. But in the background, another truth waits patiently. A sense that the self you built is very capable, very impressive perhaps, and also very tired. Tired of having to know, tired of having to lead, tired of being the one who must hold the entire narrative together. When Jung spoke of the ego being humbled, he did not mean shattered. He did not mean that you must erase yourself, deny your needs, or become small and silent. He meant something softer, the realization that the ego is not the whole of who you are, that the story you tell about yourself is just one layer, resting on depths you haven't fully met yet. Sometimes this humbling arrives as a loss, a breakup, a failure, a health scare, something that your current identity cannot easily absorb or explain away. Sometimes it arrives more quietly. In the middle of an ordinary week, when you catch yourself staring out a window, feeling strangely distant from the life you've carefully arranged. You wonder why you are not more satisfied, why the achievements don't feel solid, why the praise doesn't sink in. From the outside, nothing seems to be falling apart. On the inside, a different kind of collapse has begun. Not a collapse into nothingness, but into honesty, into the awareness that you cannot keep living as if you are the sole architect of every outcome, the single thread holding the entire pattern together. This is the ego's necessary humbling, the slow, reluctant admission that you're not the centre of the universe, and strangely, that you never needed to be. At first, this may feel like grief. You're losing a version of yourself, the competent hero of the story, the one who would someday arrive at a perfect, complete, admirable life. Letting that go stings. You might feel smaller, less important, less sure of your place. You might look back at the years of effort and wonder if you've been living for the wrong things. But underneath the grief, if you listen closely, there is also a faint sense of relief. Relief that maybe you don't have to perform your identity so tightly anymore. Relief that you don't have to know exactly who you are at all times. Relief that you can be a human being among other human beings, not a project that must constantly prove its worth. When the ego loosens its grip, life doesn't suddenly become easy. You still have responsibilities. You still have choices to make, people to care for, work to show up to. But there is a subtle shift in how much of it you believe you must control. You may notice you can say, "I don't know," with a little less shame. You may allow yourself to rest without first earning it through exhaustion. You may stop rehearsing every conversation in your head, trusting that you will find words when you need them. The self you built is not destroyed in this process. It is softened, made porous, less like armor, more like skin, still protective, still necessary, but able to breathe. You might still be the reliable one, but now with boundaries. You might still be the achiever, but now with permission to fail. You might still be the caretaker, but now with space to be cared for too. What once felt like your whole identity becomes just one aspect of a larger, more mysterious person. You, with your contradictions, with your changing desires, with parts of you that are not efficient or impressive, but deeply alive. The exhaustion you feel now may not be laziness or weakness. It may be the weight of an identity that has been holding too much for too long. An ego that has been acting as manager, protector, storyteller, and judge, without a single day off. If you're honest, you might notice it has been asking, quietly, for permission to rest, to not have all the answers, to not optimize every hour, to not constantly compare your life to an invisible timeline and come up short. There is a different kind of strength that emerges when the ego bows its head, when it says, "I am not the whole story here," when it lets in the possibility that something deeper, quieter, wiser may also be moving through your life, even when you don't understand it. You don't need to name that something. You don't need to believe anything grand or mystical. It is enough to admit that your conscious plans are not the only forces shaping you, that there are parts of you you haven't met yet, feelings you haven't allowed, longings you pushed aside because they didn't fit the image. Allowing the ego to be humbled means making room for those hidden parts, letting them whisper, letting them be clumsy and unpolished, letting them exist without immediately turning them into goals or improvements. In The Dark Night, Jung described, this soft undoing of the ego is not a punishment. It is a preparation, a making of space, so that when new life begins to grow in you, there is somewhere for it to root itself, beyond performance, beyond comparison, beyond the need to always appear in control. For now, it is enough to notice how hard you've been working just to be who you think you're supposed to be, to feel the tiredness of that, and to consider gently that it might be allowed to loosen, just a little, just enough for a breath to enter where there was only holding before. There is a moment in the dark night when the outside world finally goes quiet. The notifications slow down. The day releases its grip, and what you have been keeping at arm's length begins to move a little closer. Jung had a simple word for what many people spend a lifetime avoiding. He called it the shadow. Not evil, not a monster, just the parts of you that never got to stand in the light. The anger you were told was unacceptable. The needs you learned were too much. The softness you hid to survive. The envy you felt but never admitted. The fear that was always too embarrassing to speak aloud. Most of these parts didn't disappear. They simply stepped out of sight. They stayed quiet when you needed to perform. They smiled when you needed to be liked. They nodded when you wanted to be chosen. In the bright hours of the day, it's easy to pretend they are gone. Work is loud. Responsibilities are loud. Other people's opinions are loud. But the dark has a different kind of honesty. When life slows and you're alone with your thoughts, the shadow does something soft. It knocks. It doesn't always use words. Sometimes it arrives as heaviness in the chest. Sometimes as irritability you can't justify, sometimes as an old memory that keeps replaying without your permission. During a dark night of the soul, these fragments rise up in ways that feel inconvenient and unfair. You may notice sudden waves of sadness that don't match your day. Old embarrassments may surface with strange clarity. You might remember a version of yourself you have tried very hard to forget. It can feel like you're falling apart. It can feel like you are regressing, like you're losing the progress you thought you had made. But often something quieter is happening. What you have ignored is simply tired of being ignored. The psyche has its own timing. It keeps every story you don't finish, every reaction you suppress, every truth you swallow, not as punishment, as storage. And storage has a limit. Eventually, the old containers crack. The mask becomes too heavy. The effort of being only your acceptable self becomes exhausting. In that exhaustion, the shadow sees an opening, not to hurt you, to finally be seen. This is why, in the middle of a dark night, you might feel feelings that don't line up with your current life. You might be relatively safe, yet feel deeply afraid. You might be somewhat successful, yet feel profoundly small. You might be loved, yet feel unlovable. It doesn't mean the present is lying. It means the past is finally speaking. What you pushed aside when you were younger did not vanish. It waited, patient as grief. Grief waits for the moment when you're still enough to feel it. So does truth. So does shame. So does longing. The mind is clever. It builds whole identities around what is allowed and what is not. You become the strong one, so your fear goes underground. You become the easygoing one, so your anger goes underground. You become the accomplished one, so your insecurity goes underground. But underground things grow roots. They don't die. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he wasn't just pointing to darkness for its own sake. He was pointing to a kind of psychological exile. Parts of you were sent away, not because they were truly unworthy, but because they were inconvenient to whoever needed you at the time. In a dark night, the border of that exile becomes thin. The walls you built to keep certain feelings out begin to soften, and one by one, those exiled parts come home to your awareness. It can feel like a confrontation, like you're at war with yourself. Old mistakes stand in front of you and demand to be remembered. Old desires knock at the door of a life that has no space for them. Old wounds ask questions you don't know how to answer. But what if this is not a battle? What if it is a homecoming? The dark night can be the first time you stop running. Not because you finally became brave, but because you finally became too tired to keep performing. In that tiredness, there is a small opportunity. Instead of attacking yourself for feeling too much, you can begin to listen. Instead of saying, "What is wrong with me?" you can ask, "What is trying to reach me?" The part of you that feels jealous might not be proof of your pettiness. It might be the voice of a desire you've never allowed yourself to admit. The part of you that feels angry might not be proof that you're unkind. It might be the evidence of boundaries that were crossed for years. The part of you that feels needy might not be proof of weakness. It might be the simple fact that you were never properly held. These are not comfortable realizations. They are raw, they sting, but they are honest. And honesty, especially with oneself, is one of the rarest forms of rest. The dark gives you a strange permission. The daytime doesn't. In the bright hours, you're expected to function, to be coherent, to be presentable. At night, the performance loosens. Your expressions don't need to make sense. Your emotions don't need to be tidy. Your story doesn't need to impress anyone. This is why so many people cry in the shower, in the car, in bed when the lights are off. The darkness holds what the bright hours cannot. The mind, unpoliced by daylight expectations, lets more truth slip through. A sentence you've never dared to think might whisper itself. I'm still not over that. I never wanted this life. I'm so tired of pretending I'm okay. These thoughts can scare you. They can sound like betrayal of others, betrayal of your own image. But often they're not betrayals, they're confessions, not to the world, to yourself. In Jung's language, the shadow seeks integration, not domination. It wants to be included, not to take over. It wants a seat at the table of who you are, not to flip the table over. Meeting it is less like going to war and more like opening the door to a long-ignored guest. At first, you might only crack it open. You might only peek. You might only allow one small feeling at a time. That is enough. The psyche does not need grand gestures. It needs contact. To say quietly in the dark, yes, I do feel that. Yes, that did hurt me more than I admitted. Yes, there are parts of me I have never allowed to exist. This is how exiled parts begin to loosen, not through force but through recognition. You do not have to like everything you meet in the dark. You do not have to approve of every impulse, every memory, every reaction. You only have to stop pretending they are not there, because when you pretend they are not there, they rule from the shadows. When you acknowledge them, they become less frightening, more human, more understandable. What feels at first like a descent into chaos is often the psyche rearranging itself around a wider truth. The truth that you are not only the polished version of yourself you show to the world, you are also the unedited drafts, the deleted scenes, the feelings that did not fit the storyline. The dark night of the soul is where those drafts and deleted scenes step back into frame, not to humiliate you, not to prove your unworthiness, but to ask gently, will you finally let me belong to you? And slowly, if you allow it, the night becomes less like a void and more like a room where every part of you is allowed to sit down, even the ones you spent years keeping out in the cold. Here in the quiet, you are not fixing yourself. You are meeting yourself, piece by piece, shadow by shadow, and the darkness, instead of being an enemy, becomes a witness, a soft, patient space where what could not be seen in the bright hours is finally allowed to exist. There is a point in this night where effort starts to soften, where trying to fix yourself begins to feel like another kind of strain, another way of saying, I am not enough as I am. Jung understood this place. He knew that the deepest shifts, the ones that truly matter, do not arrive because we tighten our grip. They arrive when the grip gets tired, when the hand slowly opens, when the psyche is finally allowed to move in its own way. We are taught from an early age that change is something we do. Make a plan, set a goal, work harder, push through. And sometimes, yes, that matters. Sometimes discipline is a kindness. But in the darker seasons of the soul, this approach stops working. You can feel it. You push and nothing responds. You speak to yourself and nothing inside seems to listen. The strategies that used to move you forward suddenly feel hollow, almost mechanical. It's in this strange in-between that Jung's insight becomes quietly radical. He saw that there is a part of the psyche that already knows what it is trying to become, not the conscious part, not the part that makes lists and checks boxes and keeps track of timelines. A deeper current, a living intelligence that is not impressed by speed, that is not seduced by comparison, that is not interested in forcing a bloom before its season. In Jung's language, the self is always seeking wholeness. Even when you feel lost, something in you has not lost a thread. It is working beneath your awareness, rearranging pieces you cannot see, undoing old knots, letting certain identities fall away, widening spaces that once felt too tight to breathe in. You may feel like nothing is happening, like you are failing even at healing. But the psyche does not move on the schedule of the ego. It is not a project. It is not an exam. It is more like the slow shifting of roots under frozen ground, invisible, patient, unimpressed with your deadlines. This is what it means when we say, the darkest nights cannot be fixed, only inhabited. The dark night is not a puzzle that yields to cleverness. It is not a riddle with a right answer, if you just think hard enough. It is a process, a passage, something that moves through you as much as you move through it. And processes like this do not respond to pressure. When you try to force them, they harden. When you try to rush them, they resist. So the work changes. Instead of pushing, you begin to allow. Instead of demanding clarity, you begin to tolerate mystery. Instead of asking, how do I get out of this? You gently, reluctantly start to ask, what if something important is happening here, even if I cannot see it yet? Think of a seed resting in winter soil. From the outside, it looks like nothing, just darkness and cold and waiting. If you didn't understand how growth works, you might dig it up every few days to check on it, to make sure it's progressing, to confirm it is not wasting time. But every time you disturb the soil, you interrupt a process that depends on stillness, on pressure, on being hidden. The psyche has its own winters, its own underground seasons, times when it pulls back the light so it can reconstellate itself in ways you're not invited to witness. Old attachments loosen, outgrown hopes quietly fall away, emotions you never allowed yourself to feel slowly thaw and take shape. You might only notice the side effects, tears for no obvious reason, a sudden emptiness where certain ambitions used to live, a quiet urge to withdraw from conversations that once felt easy. You might judge these changes, call them laziness, failure, regression. But what if they are signs that something in you has begun to refuse the old performance? What if what looks like collapse is a form of inner honesty finally surfacing? Jung would say that when the ego has been humbled, when its strategies stop working, another centre has room to emerge. Not a grand, dramatic event, a slow reorganisation, like furniture being moved around in a house while you sleep. In the morning, you don't remember hearing anything. You just wake up and something feels different. The light falls in a new way. You can walk through a space that used to be blocked. This is the transformation that happens without our doing, not without our participation, but without our control. Your willingness matters, but your will is not the engine. Your curiosity matters, but your analysis is not the architect. The psyche moves because that is what living things do when given enough time, enough safety, enough permission to be exactly as they are. So tonight, your only task is not to push the river, not to demand meaning on command, not to solve yourself like a problem. Your only task is to let yourself be held by what you cannot understand, to rest even while questions remain unanswered, to breathe even while nothing seems resolved. You are allowed to not know what this season is doing to you. You are allowed to lie here without a 5-year plan, without a morning routine, without a clear narrative that turns all your suffering into instant wisdom. You are allowed to simply be a person in the middle of something important and unfinished. Notice how your mind wants to turn even this into work. How do I surrender correctly? How do I allow properly? How do I trust the process the right way? This is just the old pattern wearing softer clothes. The same pressure, the same fear, the same need to get it right. There is nothing to get right here. There is only this moment, this body, this breath, this quiet awareness of being in a night that you did not choose, but that might still be holding you. Transformation, the kind Jung spoke of, is often retroactive. You rarely feel it as it happens. You notice it in hindsight. You look back and realize that the person who entered the dark night is not quite the person who emerged. Something loosened, something quieted, something grew roots where before there were only questions. For now, you do not need to predict who you'll be on the other side. You do not need to design your future self like a project. The self that is coming does not need your micromanagement. It needs your patience, your gentleness, your willingness to stop tearing up the soil to prove that something is happening. So let tonight be unproductive in the old sense, nothing to track, nothing to optimize, just the small radical act of not abandoning yourself while you don't have answers. If you can soften even a little around the mystery, that is enough. If you can admit, I do not know what is happening, but I am still here, that is enough. If you can let your breathing deepen by a fraction, let your shoulders drop by a few millimeters, let your thoughts drift without chasing them, that is enough. Something in you knows how to knit the torn pieces together, how to reweave meaning from threads that currently look broken. You do not need to see the pattern for it to be real. You do not need to understand the darkness for it to be doing its quiet work. You are not behind in this kind of growth. There is no schedule for the soul, no map you are supposed to follow more closely. There is only this slow, invisible unfolding. This winter soil, this night that holds more than you can yet perceive. And as you lie here, not fixing, not forcing, something in you is already moving, already listening, already turning, ever so slightly, toward a dawn you do not have to create. The night does not check a clock. It does not hurry because you're uncomfortable. It does not shorten itself because you're afraid. Jung never promised that the dark would pass according to our liking. He did not say, do this, think that, and by morning you will be reborn. He knew something harder and strangely kinder, that the soul has its own tempo, its own seasons, its own long uneven breaths. Sometimes the night is brief. Sometimes it stretches across months or years, with no clear edges between dusk and dawn. You can't mark it on a calendar. You can't schedule its ending. And this is where the mind protests. It wants estimates and guarantees. It wants someone to say, just hold on for 3 more weeks, or by your next birthday, this will all make sense. But Jung watched people sit in the dark with no such promises. He watched them break and bend and slowly, quietly reform. He noticed something that doesn't sound impressive, but changes everything. Even when consciousness feels lost, even when you feel empty or directionless, something inside you keeps moving. Not in a straight line, not in a heroic arc, just slowly, stubbornly, toward wholeness. The psyche, as he saw it, does not move toward perfection. It moves toward inclusion, toward making room for what was exiled, toward allowing the unwanted parts of you to step out of the shadow and sit at the table. This movement continues even when you feel like nothing is happening, even when you feel stuck, foggy, numb, On those nights when you lie awake and think, I'm not healing, I'm just existing, something deeper than thought is still at work. Not because you're trying hard enough, not because you're doing the right techniques, simply because the human psyche leans toward integration the way a plant leans toward light. You don't force it, you don't command it. You notice it later, in retrospect, when you realize you're less afraid of what once terrified you. The end of the dark night does not announce itself with trumpets. There is no banner in the sky that says, "Congratulations, you have completed your suffering." Morning arrives the way it always has, quietly. A small change in the air, a softer kind of darkness pressing against the window, shadows beginning to have shape again. You wake not to a new world, but to the same one, the same ceiling, the same room, the same unanswered questions waiting politely at the edge of the bed. The miracle, if we can call it that, is not that everything has changed. It is that you are still here. You take a breath and realize it goes a little deeper than it did yesterday. You sit up and your chest feels a fraction less heavy. Not weightless, just slightly more spacious, nothing grand, no revelation that explains your entire life, no sudden certainty about your future, just the ordinary courage of putting your feet on the floor and noticing that the floor still meets you. This is how dawn often comes, after a psychological night, not as triumph, not as a cinematic breakthrough, but as continuation. You are still the person who walked into the dark, and yet you are not exactly the same. Some days the change is so quiet you almost miss it. You realize you can think about what once haunted you without flinching quite as much. You find yourself reacting a little more slowly, with a breath between stimulus and response. You notice that you're less interested in impressing the people who used to define your worth. You may not have language for it. You just sense that something subtle has shifted. This is what happens when the psyche does its work beneath your plans and preferences. Sometimes you wake and feel nothing different at all. Only tired, only ordinary. That, too, is part of dawn. Not every morning after the dark night feels radiant. Many feel plain. The miracle hides in their plainness, because you're still willing to live this day, even without guarantees. You make coffee. You answer a message. You notice the way light rests on the corner of the table. These small acts of participation are not a return to the person you were. They are the first shy expressions of the person emerging now. You do not need to name them yet. You do not need to understand how you've changed. Explanation can come later, or not at all. For now, it is enough that you're here, with a little more space between you and the story that once defined you. Jung did not ask people to rush this. He did not tell them to fix the night or speed it up. He trusted that something in them knew the way through better than their conscious mind did. And so, the invitation of the dark night was strangely simple and strangely hard. To stay. To remain in relationship with your own experience, even when it is wordless, even when it is heavy. The night does not ask you to be brave in some grand way. It does not demand insight or constant self-analysis or endless productivity. It asks only for your presence, not your best self, not your most insightful self, just the you that actually exists in this moment, the scared you, the disappointed you, the numb you who isn't sure what you feel at all. All of them are allowed to lie here. When you stop trying to perform growth, when you let the night be night, something loosens. You are no longer fighting time. You are no longer negotiating with the darkness, promising to accept yourself only after it has passed. You are simply here, breathing inside a process that is older than you, older than your fears, older than every story you have been told about success and failure. And in that quiet surrender, the psyche keeps moving, slowly rearranging how you hold your pain, slowly widening what you can feel without collapsing, until one morning or one afternoon, or in the middle of doing something ordinary, you realize you're no longer standing in the same place inside yourself. The landscape hasn't changed dramatically, but your stance has. You belong to yourself a little more. You believe your own feelings a little more. You trust that even when the next night comes, as nights always do, there's something in you that knows how to endure it. Not perfectly, not gracefully, just faithfully. The dawn that comes unbidden is not a reward for having handled the darkness well. It is simply the next movement in a rhythm that does not depend on your success. You are part of that rhythm whether you notice it or not. For now, you do not need to hurry your healing, justify your pace, or prove you have changed. You are allowed to rest in the fact that morning will come when it comes, and that who you are becoming is unfolding quietly beneath everything you can see. The night asks nothing more of you than to remain here as you are, and let time do what time always does. Carry you slowly toward another day. Stay here with me for a moment. Not in the past, not in the future, just here. Let your attention drip back down into your body. Notice the simple things your mind usually skips over. The way the air feels on your skin, the weight of your head where it's resting, the pull of gravity quietly holding you in place. You don't have to fix anything from this day. You don't have to understand your whole life tonight. Right now, nothing is required of you. You are allowed to simply exist. Feel your breathing again, not perfectly, just honestly. The soft rise, the gentle fall. Maybe the breath is shallow, maybe it's deep. It doesn't need to be better than it is. It only needs to be noticed. Around you, there is more dark than light, not the threatening kind, the kind that wraps around you like a room with the door softly closed, the kind that asks nothing, the kind that lets you be unfinished. You've spent so much time trying to think your way to safety, trying to think your way to worth. For now, you don't have to try. Your body already knows how to rest. Your breath already knows how to keep going without you managing it. You're already held by something larger than your waking mind can organize, by rhythms older than your plans, by a life that keeps moving through you, even when you feel stuck on the surface. You don't need to earn this. You don't need to deserve this. Existence itself has already said yes to you, or you would not be here at all. Let the words grow softer now, like a voice in another room. You don't have to follow every sentence. You can drift in and out. You can let whole phrases pass by untouched. If thoughts come, they can come. If they go, they can go. You don't have to chase them or argue with them. They can wander like people leaving a theatre after the film is over, slowly, quietly, in their own time. Notice again the points of contact, the bed holding your weight, the fabric against your skin, the slight heaviness in your eyelids, the way your hands have started to forget their hands and just feel like warmth. You are not behind in this moment. There's nowhere else you're supposed to be. No timeline you have to catch up to before you close your eyes. Night does not ask for your progress report. It only asks that you let yourself be carried for a while. The voice can thin out now. Less explanation, less story. Just presence beside you in the dark. Just breath beside breath. just the quiet facts that you are here, and that is enough for tonight. If you are still awake, still hovering at the edge of sleep, you can let one last bit of honesty surface. What are your thoughts dwelling on lately? What did you need to hear most tonight? When you're ready, you can leave those in the comments as a small truth offered into the same darkness we're all learning to rest inside.